Αρχίζω. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to this discussion on European sovereignty in a changing world. This panel discussion is organized by the Hellenic Foundation for European and Foreign Policy, otherwise known as ELIAMEP, and it is part of the 6th Delphi Economic Forum. I am Loukas Tsoukalis, and I have the pleasure and honor to moderate this discussion. We have a very distinguished panel today. I understand there are some technical problems, so for the time being, we only have the first panelist who is able to join us, and this is the Minister of Foreign Affairs, European Union and Cooperation of the Kingdom of Spain, Mrs. Arantxa González Laya. Welcome, Minister.
Good morning. Kalimera.
Morning to
Kalimera.
You. Kalimera. Buenos días. She became minister in January 2020. Before that, she had a very distinguished career in the European Commission and in international organizations, including the World Trade Organization and the International Trade Center. Ms. González is multilingual, and she holds a PhD in European law from the Carlos III University in Madrid. Minister, we are asked to discuss today the subject of European sovereignty. You know better than I do that sovereignty is not a concept we're used to employ with reference to the European Union. We talk about sovereignty as something to be shared within the European Union, but European Union as a sovereign actor is a rather new thing. And what I would like to ask you to start our discussion is, why is it that we talk about sovereignty today? What has changed? What is the geopolitical and geoeconomic reality to which the European Union is called upon to respond? And are we really up to it? So can you start with your introductory remarks?
Thank you very much, and thanks for this invitation to join the panel at the Delphi Forum, and for putting this item of European sovereignty on the agenda. Let me perhaps start by describing what the international landscape looks like. It's a landscape marked by rivalry. It's a landscape marked by a big geopolitical confrontation with the US on one side, with China on the other side. There are many other risks and actors and challenges, but these two are in a way shaping the international landscape. And for Europe, especially after a term of a presidency in the United States marked by President Donald Trump, and marked by what has happened during this period, the question has become, are we actors that can shape the international landscape in this context of rivalry, or will we just be shaped by the decisions taken by others? So the discussion about Europe's strategic sovereignty has, let's say, as a raison d'etre, this question about whether Europe wants to be an actor that shapes the future, that shapes the responses to our current challenges, that shapes the global geopolitical landscape, or whether we would just be environment takers, meaning we will have to follow what others do, and all we would have to do is align ourselves on this or with this or on that or with that. So in this geopolitical landscape, Europe's response clearly is one of a strategic sovereignty. Let me tell you that I rather speak of geopolitical, let's say, strategic autonomy or strategic resilience than strategic sovereignty. Sovereignty is a word that I use very cautiously because of the tones that it has for many of us in many parts of the world. And I think that for Europe, that wants to remain an open society, an open economy, an open regional bloc, it is probably more accurate to speak about a strategic autonomy or strategic resilience, if you wish, especially in this context of a world post-pandemic. Now, a strategic autonomy, from where we sit here in Spain, does not mean Europe as a fortress, Europe as being closed to the rest of the world, Europe as looking inwards, but rather it means an open European space which wants to resolve and to address global challenges through international cooperation, building alliances, investing in multilateralism, working with allies and friends when allies and friends are ready to do that. But a strategic autonomy also means the ability for the European Union to stand on its 2 feet when its friends or allies do not want to invest together or do not want to join hands in addressing global challenges. And on this, again, we may have been a bit influenced by the presidency of Donald Trump. So a strategic autonomy, which is open, which is working with allies, which is working with friends, which is working in a multilateral setting, but with an ability for Europe to respond to shape an answer to global challenges when it's the only solution that Europe has. We've seen this, by the way, in the last 4 years, with Europe standing firmly to defend climate change and the decarbonization of our economy and the decarbonization of world economies and the protection of biodiversity, even when its biggest ally and friend, the United States, under President Trump, was not in a position to do that. So this is what we mean by strategic autonomy, again, seen from Spain. Of course, to those studying international relations, strategic autonomy, this discussion started in defense and security circles. So a big component of this strategic autonomy is the ability to defend ourselves faced with attacks. And here I would say that for a country like Spain that is member of the European Union, but also member of NATO, the answer is not to recreate a NATO at the European space, but rather to invest in greater coherence between what we do in terms of security and defense at the European level and what we are already doing in NATO, and articulating better our efforts. In Europe, for example, we are investing much more in a common European security and defense industry, which is good because it speaks of our ability to build a competitive industry. Whereas in NATO, we are talking a lot about articulating together our forces to defend ourselves faced with challenges and threats. So security and defense for Europe must mean, at least for a European country like Spain, articulating better Europe with NATO. But this strategic autonomy goes well beyond security and defense. Today, it means also technological autonomy, our ability to be a player in the technological space. And for Europe, this means investing in regulating technology and investing in technological capacities, some of which we've really underinvested in these last years, to be quite honest. It also means investing more to develop and to advance a number of industrial sectors in Europe, sectors that are the sectors of the future, from the cloud to green hydrogen to the electric vehicle of the future. All of these doing the investment at the European level, not at the national level, not at the level of only one or two European member states, but at a truly European level. Strategic autonomy also needs for Europe to look at working more to internationalize our currency, the euro. So all of this, not to speak of boosting our trade and investment capacities, it's all of this that makes the backbone of this concept of greater strategic autonomy or resilience, which again, wants for Europe is to provide an answer to our European citizens, protect our European citizens, and finding the best way to do this, confronted with an international landscape that is marked by an increased rivalry.
Thank you very much, Minister. I keep two or three main points. One is you stressed the change in the geopolitical landscape. You talked about increasing confrontation between the United States and China. You spoke about new challenges, including technology, climate. You spoke about strategic autonomy. I understand you prefer the concept to sovereignty. It's perhaps less politically loaded. And I understand by strategic autonomy our capacity, as you said, to shape things as opposed to take the world as a given. And now I would like to go to our second panelist who's joined us, Daniela Schwarzer, who's an old friend, an expert on European foreign policy, German foreign policy, recently appointed as Executive Director for Open Society Foundations for Europe and Eurasia. And until recently, she was director of the German Council of Foreign Relations, the Deutsche Gesellschaft für Auswärtige Politik. So, Daniela, what do you think? Is Europe up to it? Is strategic autonomy really an operational concept for Europe in a world where technological developments, climate, in which strategic autonomy about crucial industrial sectors is becoming very important? Are Europeans willing and ready to recognize that their common interests are stronger than things that divide them? What do you think?
I believe that we are on a good track, but we are by far not there where we should be. And if we look at the analysis of Minister González and the very broad areas she has pointed out where Europe has to really get its act together and be more of a strategic autonomous actor, it becomes very clear that we have a huge job to do. Now, the good news is definitely that the debate, as we have it today, is spreading around Europe and has spread around Europe. And we have heard from the minister that different concepts are out there, the idea of European sovereignty, the concept of strategic autonomy, which by far is not a new invention, but goes back years in time when it was first approached by or used by the European Council. So beyond that conceptual discussion, I believe we have to focus on our capacity to act, and that is a really practical approach. So we have to look at the different areas that the minister pointed out, and we have to define priorities. And this indeed is very difficult for Europeans from time to time, because perspectives on some of the issues still greatly diverge. And I would like to emphasize the importance of one of the new tools that the EU has just given to itself. Around the change of the year, the strategic compass of the European Union was published for the first time. And this instrument, which is basically an analysis of the risks and threats and the challenges out there in our neighborhood, but also globally. This document basically brings together the 27 perspectives of the member states, but brings them into one European whole. And in my view, this is really the first step we have to achieve, to have a joint and shared understanding of our environment, and then define the strategic priorities. When it comes to this practical step of defining priorities, of course, national interests prevail, and sometimes even national reflexes that are short-sighted, because not necessarily in all domestic debates have we reached a depth of understanding how big the challenges are out there in this world. But if we look at the area of defense, and here we have, of course, the double framework of structured defense cooperation within the EU, the so-called PESCO, and then NATO as the important context. If we look there and Europe, what Europe brings to the table, if we look at the area of technology and the fact that we lag behind on a number of currently developing technologies and possibly also on future technologies, just to take those two examples, it becomes very clear that we have to think about our own development in cooperation with our allies and with our partners in order to catch up in the field of technology, for instance, but also in order to honor the alliances we have and which protect us, as in the case of NATO. So for me, this is no contradiction to think about European strategic autonomy or capacity to act, as I prefer calling it, and our deep alliances, which we have in particular with the United States. But of course, we have learned from the Trump years, where Europe was under big pressure from the United States, that we have to take better care of ourselves. And this doesn't mean turning away. It basically means bringing something more important to the table and being a better partner. And I believe that's the way we need to approach this. But we have to be extremely serious in our efforts to act more quickly and more decisively as Europeans, because otherwise even a large country like Germany, which is my background, wouldn't be able to do anything really in this globally and rapidly changing world. So in order to defend our interests based on the European values which we have, we can bring our weight to the table together. And we have a lot. We have a lot of soft power. We have a lot of economic power. We are building stronger tech competitiveness, and we are thinking more about defense and foreign policy also. And I think we are, as I said, on a track, but we by far not have reached our goals.
Thank you very much. Now, it seems to me you've touched on a very sensitive issue, and this is the link between strategic autonomy and Europe's participation in the Atlantic Alliance. And we all know that some of our European partners, especially those in Central and Eastern Europe, are extremely sensitive about those things. And whenever people talk about European sovereignty or strategic autonomy, some people suspect that this is a way of undermining, directly or indirectly, the Atlantic Alliance. So do you see any contradiction, really, between Europe's attempt to act as a strategic actor, recognizing also that international economic issues are becoming increasingly politicized, and our continued membership of the Atlantic Alliance? Minister, what do you think?
Well, first, I don't see any contradiction between wanting to be strong in Europe and having strong alliances with others like the US. Actually, I would think that your allies would prefer you to be strong because this is what would make the alliance also strong. And I therefore do not see a contradiction. But what I see is for Europe, and this is more an internal issue, a necessity to build more cohesion within Europe and to build more coherence between the different instruments that Europe has, some of which are purely in national hands, in the hands of the EU member states, and some of which are at the level of the community, meaning they are common tools that we have. Trade policy is a common tool, whereas a big part of the defense policy is in purely national hands. So to me, first, there is no contradiction, and second, we do have a lot of homework to do in Europe to build cohesion and coherence, two big words in order to make our European position stronger, and through that to be able to project a stronger alliance with the United States, but also with other parts of the world with whom we want to build also alliances, whether this is with Latin American countries, whether it's with India, whether it's... So for us, being strong, meaning being resilient, being autonomous, means being in a position to be a better ally.
Thank you very much. Mrs. Schwarzer, what do you think? Is there a contradiction really, or would you agree with the Minister that we can do both things?
I fully agree with the Minister, but from our perspective, from a European perspective, and actually we do have to be a stronger partner to many actors in the world, and not only the United States, and maybe we can come to others in a moment. But we of course also know that others may see this differently. When Europe developed its concept of strategic autonomy more recently, as I said, it's an old idea, but under the Trump administration, this concept reached a new salience in the European debate. And of course, the reactions in the United States were very critical. And not only conceptually and sort of in a way politicizing this concept against Europeans, there were really hard interests involved. Because if you look at the way Europe developed its defense cooperation, PESCO, there were moments where, for instance, the involvement of third countries in basically in armament projects or other initiatives wasn't very clear. So there were real concerns that some actors could be pushed out of European cooperation and the European market. So there were reactions against that. So you see the sensitivities, but Europe really conceives of this cooperation as being part of the NATO alliance. So the necessary precautions were found, not only to bring other actors into this defense cooperation, but also to really embed the European initiatives within the NATO alliance. But this is just an example which I wish to quote to show you that even if we think about our own intentions in a very well-intended way, and we want to strengthen Europe as part of the alliances and partnerships we have, we always have to be aware that this change of Europe, and if Europe does become a more forceful and powerful and decided actor globally, there will be others who will react. And so we have to make sure we communicate what we are up to in a very clear way, which means we shouldn't raise too high expectations, because this is a long and intense process for us to get our act together. And at the same time, we have to confirm over and over again what our commitments are. And in my view, that means our shared Western liberal value base on the one hand, but then also our alliances and our partnerships, which we have built over decades.
So, hasten slowly, perhaps would be the motto to adopt for the European Union in terms of foreign policy. Now, we started essentially as an economic actor. We talked about Europe as a soft power, civilian power. Defense and security affairs were left to NATO. And as the time goes by, we discover that the two merge more and more together. And technology becomes highly politicized. And not only, we're talking about industrial policy and strategic autonomy. Europe is or tries to be a global actor in some respects, but it is also and has the interest in being a regional power. And if one looks at the map, and this is of course no news to all of you, Europe's neighborhood is a long arc of instability, starting from northeast and going to southwest. This neighborhood catches fire, and it often has the bad habit of exporting instability to Europe. We've tried in the past, through association agreements, prospects of membership and so on, to stabilize our neighborhood, with very limited success so far. What do you think? Do you think that Europe has the capacity to influence events in our neighborhood? Can it really act as a stabilizing factor? Or are we too divided internally when it comes to former Soviet republics, to the Middle East volcano, and so on? What do you think, Minister?
Well, first, I would say that caring about Europe's neighborhood must be one of our main geopolitical objectives. It's the first circle. It's those countries that are our neighbors, whether they are to the east or whether they are to the south. We need to make this our geopolitical priority, starting with the countries in the Balkans, which again we need to care about before we look at the east and not the south. So yes, it has to be a geopolitical objective. Yes, it has to be for the entire European Union. This is why Spain is investing a lot to make sure that the southern neighborhood, the one that is in the vicinity of our country, this priority is shared not just by countries in the southern part of the European Union, but also in the northern and eastern part of the European Union. And for the same reasons, we are taking a keener interest also in what's happening in the eastern neighborhood of the European Union, because it has to be a geopolitical priority for the entire European Union. Now, of course, we will not be able to address all the challenges that the neighborhood poses. We would have to work with friends and allies, starting with the countries themselves. This is why we've been also insisting on this principle of co-responsibility. It should not be a north-south or an east-west relationship. It should be one that's built on co-responsibility. Many of the issues that the southern neighbors of the European Union faces are challenges that Europe faces too: climate change, youth unemployment, migratory flows, the need to invest in innovation, the need to nurture democracies and build respect for human rights. We should work on all of this on the basis of co-responsibility. Now, of course, there are also big geopolitical challenges, even bordering defense and security. And for that, again, Europe should not do this alone. Europe should also work with friends and allies in this concept of strategic autonomy, open, built on alliances, built on working together.
Thank you very much. Daniela Schwarzer, what do you think about the neighborhood? Is there any chance that Europe can really influence developments in our immediate neighborhood? So far, with very little success.
Europe has to do its best to achieve that, because we are very much, well, how can I put it, under pressure if the situation in our neighborhood continues to deteriorate. We have on the eastern border of the European Union, we have a continuous standoff with Russia over Ukraine, but this spreads well into the European Union as well, with Russian interventionism within the EU. And so we cannot look away from that. And what is true, and you alluded to that, Loukas, earlier on, there are very different perspectives on how to deal with Russia in the European Union. There are some who are really concerned by a physical threat, and they feel that, and in particular when the Russian troops were moved to the eastern border of Ukraine, this concern among Europeans grew even more, particular in Poland and the Baltic states. And then if we look to other European countries further west and further south, the perception of Russia is of course not that urgent, because the proximity of the threat is not felt in the same way. And also the extent to which Russia intervenes within the nation states differs across the European Union. So here is another need to build a joint understanding of what we are facing. And then we need to build a very realistic picture of what Russia represents to Europe today. What the country is willing to do and what it is not to do. And I believe over the past month, the picture grew even more realistic about the Russian president's goals and also his willingness to cooperate. And it doesn't look like we are at the moment at a point in time where we can easily think of a relaunch of the relationship with Russia, as some member governments, for instance, the French president has put forward as an idea. But we need to keep the dialogue ongoing, because the situation, in my personal view, is not beneficial to either the Europeans or Russia. But at the same time, Europe needs to stand very firm on its principles and on the ability of the countries in our eastern neighborhood to choose where they want to develop. For the southern neighborhood of the European Union, I think the big threat we would fear there is, of course, again, instability. But we also know that we need these countries as partners when we deal with migration flows, which will very probably increase in the future. And so we have a keen interest here as well. A final thought, in our neighborhood, we have other external players intervening and building their own power base. And I wish to mention China at this point. So this is not only countries struggling for their own future, but in many countries, we see the intervention of global conflicts that crystallize in local and regional environments. And if the European Union does not build a stronger ability, together with its partners, and here, of course, the United States, although we see this, pulling back Afghanistan as a key example, we need to be present, because if we are not, other players will arrange the situation in Europe's neighborhood. And as I said, there are big concerns to be had in terms of security. We haven't already yet talked about the issue of terrorism. All those are issues that Europe has a keen interest in, and we simply cannot afford to wait longer and say this is too complicated, we cannot do anything. Of course, we can't solve the problems, but we have to recognize that we want to be a stabilizing partner for those countries, and we have to be better at showing this and doing so.
Thank you very much. I am told by control, and I see him now, that we've been joined by Radek Sikorski. Welcome, Mr. Sikorski. Let me briefly introduce him. Radek Sikorski is a well-known Polish politician and intellectual, if I may say so. He is presently member of the European Parliament, member of various committees of the European Parliament, and president of the Delegation for Relations with the United States. He served in the past as Defense Minister, Foreign Minister of Poland, and also Speaker of the Parliament. Welcome. And the question I would like to ask you is the following, Mr. Sikorski. Experience tells us that membership of the European Union has been until now by far the most powerful instrument of foreign policy for the Union. It has helped to stabilize parts of the European continent. It has helped to export democracy, market economy, and all the rest. Now, as the European Union has been approaching the borders of what is now Russia, it suddenly came across views that there are spheres of influence, and spheres of influence may be incompatible with the extension of European membership closer to the Russian border. What do you think? What are the prospects of our relations with Putin's Russia?
I'll come to that, but let me first say that I don't think we are sovereign as the European Union. Whichever definition of sovereignty you take, whether it's the exclusive right to use force on your territory or exclusive right to make foreign treaties, we don't have it. And we don't have it because we are not a federation. We are a confederation with some federal features. For example, the European Commission exclusively makes trade treaties on our behalf. But of course, that's a right that nation states can take back if they wished. I prefer the term strategic autonomy. And even there, we haven't achieved it yet. We are autonomous in trade and regulation. And in those areas, we are actually a superpower. But we are a defense pygmy. And we have not yet made the euro a global currency, and we are not yet immune from being dictated to in the financial sphere. And without those prerequisites, we cannot be a serious player in foreign affairs. Now, to your question about Europe's foreign policy, in my view, we are in breach of the Lisbon Treaty, which has very strong provisos as to how our foreign policy should be conducted. We have pledged ourselves to collaborate and loyally carry out agreed joint policy. And member states don't do it. They sort of agree joint policy in Brussels at the Foreign Affairs Council, but then on anything that matters, relations with China, relations with Iran, relations with the United States, relations with Russia, with Ukraine, and so on, important member states freelance. And of course, if you're in breach of a treaty and if you don't act together, you can't be surprised that we are not effective. So first of all, we should do what we have already pledged ourselves to do. Now, when it comes to Russia, Russia until about 2010 wanted to associate itself with us. We were negotiating a partnership and cooperation agreement. At some point, Russia decided that she will be a rival pole of integration. A customs union and a Euro-Asiatic union that will try to achieve parity with us, with the United States, and with China. Russia hasn't succeeded, but it means that in countries in between, there are rival models of integration. So we have created Eastern Partnership, and 3 countries, Ukraine, Moldova, and Georgia, have signed deep and comprehensive free trade agreements, and they are integrating economically with the European Union, whereas other countries, Belarus, Armenia, Azerbaijan, I think is in the middle, are integrating with Russia. And that is the source of the friction, but we should remember that it was Russia's decision. We wanted Russia to also be associated with the EU and also have the benefits of deep and comprehensive free trade area. It is Russia that changed its mind.
Now, I see we have 8 minutes left. So my last question to all of you would be if you can briefly tell us what do you think will be the 2 main priorities for the European Union as an international actor in the years in the immediate future. Let me start with Daniela Schwarzer. 2 main priorities for the European Union as an international actor for the next 2 or 3 years.
My first priority would really be to bring more ideas and initiatives to the table how we rebuild a very productive transatlantic relationship. So efforts were made. There is a first strategy document coming out of Brussels. Some of the member states have said something, but in my sense, we are at the point of disappointing the Biden administration on our, how can I put it, on our creativity and our foresightedness, what we should be handling together with the United States, and also how we increase our own role in this. And this brings me back to the very beginning of our discussion and Minister González' outline of what Europe really needs to achieve. This is something we need to bring to this partnership, our capacity to act on a number of key issues. And maybe my second priority, and one more point on that, and that includes a very clear positioning on China and Russia. And we have just gone through the internal work that this requires among the member states to get a joint line. My second priority really is an inward-looking one, because we need the tools to act internationally, but in many instances, this will not work unless we revisit our state of integration and inner strength. Just to pick one example, again, going back to Minister González' priority list, she spoke about the international role of the euro. We know this is nothing we can just wish for, but we need to be very honest with ourselves. Have we built the internal strength we need to achieve this? No, of course not. The Eurozone remains incomplete. We need a deeper capital market, banking union, and so on to develop then the external tool we need. And in this world where security, defense, and foreign policy today are totally blended with economic and financial topics and other policy areas like tech, which we also discussed, Europe needs to become far more integrated in its thinking about its strategic capacity to achieve its goals and to bring the instruments and tools to the table to do just that. So this not only needs inner strength, as I said, but to some extent also a reorganization of our external action, not only in Brussels, where integration between the different areas is being worked on, but also in member states. Because unless we integrate all of those areas in a world which is characterized by great power competition and increasing conflict, which is played out with geo-economic instruments, we won't be able to pursue our interests and shape the world as we think it should be.
Mr. Tsoukalis, in 1.5 minutes, what are your first two priorities for the European Union in the next 2 or 3 years?
At the highest level of organization, I think the challenge is to be a good ally to the United States and to collaborate with the United States on regulation, on standards in its confrontation with China, but not so much as to be drawn into anything kinetic between China and the United States. And Europe can play an important role here. And two practical suggestions I would have is, one, we need to go to qualified majority voting in the Foreign Affairs Council. And second, we need to develop the battle group concept to create a real defense capability. I'm thinking of a brigade-size unit drawn from volunteers from member states that would be Foreign Affairs Council, and to the newly created defense budget, finance from that budget. And on top of that budget, we need a commissioner for defense in the European Commission. Thank you.
That sounds very ambitious and radical. Last word to Madrid. Minister.
The beauty of being the last one is that I can embrace my predecessors' priorities and not two more. I'll start with one that is very close to home. If we really want to be serious about being strategically autonomous, we have to start by advancing the process of accession to the European Union of our closest neighbors in the Balkans. If we cannot move with Albania and Northern Macedonia, if we cannot move and open the road for the remainder of the countries that are awaiting the accession process, we will not be a serious foreign policy actor. So first, accession to the European Union, starting rapidly with Albania and Northern Macedonia, who are ready to go. Second, I think Europe has to lead the reform of multilateralism, the reform of multilateral organizations and multilateral frameworks, the rules of the World Trade Organization, the international framework for addressing health. As we know from the pandemic, it requires a little bit of a rethink, or why not developing a new governance for the technology. So accession, Balkans, at home, and reform of multilateralism, this is what I would put on my to-do list.
Thank you very much. Now we have run out of time, so it's for me to thank you all three for a very interesting discussion and for contributing your ideas, thoughts to our debate on European, perhaps strategic autonomy as opposed to European sovereignty. Thank you and goodbye.